Hi, everybody.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Matt.
That's right. Man. So this is really cool. I've been a delegate before, and I love being here, whether it's as a delegate or on the other side of the table. Like Mike said, this forum holds a special place in my heart. I think it's a good group of folks. You know, sort of every time I come here, whether again as a delegate or a vendor. And so it's great to be able to talk to you all about what I've been building for the past year. Myself and then a few other folks at Juniper. Derek Winkworth is actually the community manager for a lot of this stuff. You guys probably know him as Cloud Toad. He couldn't make it. He's dealing with some stuff. He really wanted to be here, but just FYI, this is not a sole effort. This is something we're trying to really build from a grassroots perspective. So what I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about what Mike sort of hit on. And actually, I don't want to do too much of this. I want to talk for about 5% of the time on just a little bit of the motivation behind a lot of this. Mike touched on most of it, so I just want to sort of ramp off from what he said and talk a little bit more about what we've done to sort of help solve those consumption side problems that he talked about. So you're going to need a little thought leadering from me, but I'll try to keep it 5%. The vast majority is going to be, 55% is going to be, what we built. I'm going to talk about what it is that we've actually, what skin have we put in the game to try to help solve this problem. And then the last, sort of 35% or so, again, time permitting, I'm going to hope to dive into the details of how the stuff that we've built actually works. I think that's cool, but again, the whole point of this is me making sure that everybody can get something out of what we've built. So that's my primary objective. You might notice that there's a sliver missing. That last 5% is me trying really hard not to speak too fast. But those of you that know me probably know it's going to look a little bit more like that. Okay, so this is a term we also use and have for about a year. It was last year that we presented last as Juniper at Field Day 17, I think. And we touched on a few of these things, but a year is a long time, and we've had a lot of time to think about this. Mike talks about the consumption side problems. He's very right. Like we don't have a production side problem. Now, this doesn't mean we're not going to continue to build compelling products and move open source projects and do the technology thing. We're going to continue to do that. But the bottleneck in the industry is far less of a technology, has much less of a technology nature than a people and process nature. And so that's what we're focusing on. The difference here being that networking is not a thing, right? Networks are a thing, but networking is people. Networking is what ties those things together. I don't care what your infrastructure looks like. I think those of us that do production networks for a living know this. That there's not one solution that you can get that addresses 100% of your problems. Whatever success means to you, whether it's the project that's on your plate, your organizational goals, revenue goals, anything, that you're going to have to tie it all together somehow, and that's done with people. I don't care what layer of the stack you're at. That's how every single operations team works. And so for us, the definition for us for automation is it's not a thing you go get. It's not a thing you download. It's not something that you plug in and you piece together from a technology perspective. It is an operational paradigm. And as Lisa was keen to point out yesterday, I've been in marketing for a year, so I get to use that word. So nah. So anyway, my point here is that the reason I think we're in this position, one of the biggest reasons we're in this position is that we've tried for so long to get a pure technology approach to solve all of our problems. And I think what we're doing as an industry now is recognizing that it's insufficient. We have to bring people along for the ride, otherwise we're just going to fail. So that's what we're doing. The name we've sort of given to this is network reliability engineering. Now, this isn't Juniper's term. Some people think it is because we've been talking about it a lot for the past year, but it's actually not. This term, network reliability engineering, actually came from a lot of our customers. Again, about a year ago when I started at Juniper, we also noticed some of our customers actually exclusively hiring for this particular term. And for those that don't know the history there, network reliability engineering is actually heavily inspired by the far more popular site reliability engineering, so SRE. And if you don't know what that is, it's a term that Google originally popularized about 10 years ago for describing the way they do operations. It's not a magical, sort of like ethereal thing to them. It's a very specific job role. In fact, if you hear people talk about it these days, they'll even compare it to programming constructs. So DevOps, it's a big cloudy word, right? If DevOps is an abstract interface, then SRE is a specific implementation of that for the programming nerds in the audience. So what this tells me is that there are some tangible things here. And by the way, the same thing is true for NRE, right? This is just sort of a different coat of paint on the same underlying principles. We've observed in conversations with our customers, conversations with those of us at Juniper that have run production networks, myself, Cloud Toad, and so on and so forth. And we've identified these 6 sort of key vital behaviors that we feel describes a network reliability engineer. And the cool thing about this, there's a few cool things about this term. First off, it's more than just automation, right? This is more than just a different way of calling it automation. Automation is included in this for sure, but it's more than that. It's a representation that existing skill sets matter too, right? And it's in the name, right? N and E are right there in the name. So just from the outset, we're recognizing that those skills are extremely important and they carry forward into the new world. But just like we always beat around the bush talking about, there needs to be a refocusing of our efforts. What is it that we do when we automate? What's the whole point of doing any of that? Just because we like writing scripts? Some of us, sure. I'll raise my hand on that one. But the real point of doing automation is much more about making our infrastructure more predictable, more reliable, more resilient, right? That's the point. That's the reason we do it. And the reason we do that is because we're infrastructure. That is our job. If anything is aligned to some other goal, then we're off the path, right? So if we're talking about automation in the context of reliability, we're on the right path. Anywhere else, and we're deviating. So I won't go too far down this road. We have a page there. What is NRE? Feel free to go there. We can, you can see a little bit of detail here. I can tell you we're going to come out with a lot of material this year that puts a lot of meat on these bones, because there's a lot of partners actually asking us how they do a lot of this stuff, and so we're going to be putting out a lot of tangible materials for adopting these behaviors. Okay. So in the meantime, what have we done? Well, I'm pleased to introduce this to you folks. We launched this in October, so it's been out for a little bit, but we've been working really hard on it, even post-launch. This wasn't something we just put out in October and then just forgot about. We've actually been very actively working on this. So we created NRE Labs, and as the slide says, effectively what NRE Labs is a community platform for learning and teaching automation and these NRE principles. Now I use those 2 words, learning and teaching, both very intentionally, and I'll get into that. But just a few bullet point summaries. It's totally browser-based. So you want to learn automation. One of the biggest challenges, and I'm guilty of this, and I'll build like GitHub repos and blog posts that say, oh yeah, learning Ansible is super easy. All you have to do is set up this Vagrant environment. Oh, and make sure you have Git installed and it's patched to this version. Oh, by the way, if you run Kubernetes, that won't hurt. And like all of this stuff needs to be set up in advance. Guess what? Most people don't have the time to do that, even if they know what all those things are, and most of them don't. So what ends up happening is that you have like 90% of the time learning things that you didn't want to learn in the first place just to learn that 10% that you came to learn. I find that unacceptable, right? We have to fix that problem. And I think NRE Labs puts us down that path of focusing only on the thing you came to learn. And how do we do that? We do that by preparing the environment in advance for you, and you just go to the web page. There's no setup. You just go to the web page, and you're in. So the second point is, it's free. There's no login or email even. No, you don't have to log in or anything like that. A lot of the pages that I'm going to show you here, if you go to the page that I go to, you're going to get the same experience. No authentication whatsoever, no email collection. And I should also mention, I got corrected for saying that we don't do any cookies. We do 1 cookie, but that cookie is just to make sure you get back into the lab that you're in. We don't record it anywhere. So it's cookieless in the right way. Ish. Bunch of nerds correcting people on the internet.
Cookie light.
Anyway. Third, it's vendor neutral. This is, again, I'm really glad Mike stood up in front of you guys and explained our motivations behind this, because that sounds weird coming from a vendor, but it is. And I promise you that's going to be the spirit of it going forward. Now, will there be Juniper technologies represented? Sure. But the point isn't that this is going to be a place for us to show you how awesome Juniper is. We have other resources for that. We don't need another one. What NRE Labs is aimed at doing is it's aimed at bringing the industry up together. And again, we benefit from that, as Mike said, but the whole point is we have to start from a place of learning the skills and the tools and the processes that you need to learn that isn't directly tied to some sort of a product family. That's what this is about. And I'm going to skip actually to the last point where I say workflow is king. That's the reason why it's vendor neutral, because for us, this isn't about a specific technology, right? Tools don't solve problems. People solve problems when they use those tools in a specific applied way. And that's exactly the inspiration for NRE Labs. So we're always looking at that as the goal of what we build. And then to go back 1 point, it's open source. And I mean this in a very broad way because there's a few things going on here. It's built on some off-the-shelf open source software. Kubernetes happens to run behind the scenes. You don't see that, but that's what it runs on top of. So some off the shelf. We also developed some custom software to make it work, so some scheduling and some web-based stuff. And then we've open sourced that, and then we've actually figured out a way to represent curriculum as code. And so and I can show this in the final examples, where we've actually defined lessons as simple YAML files and text files that we store in Git that you can contribute to. And you can see them on GitHub. You can see the actual lessons that I'm going to show you in the graphical format as code in GitHub if you are so motivated. Sound cool? So that's pretty fun. Last slide for now. I want to quickly just highlight the difference between, in our mind, what we think NRE Labs and EngineNet are aimed at doing. A lot of folks, they sort of look at these things and they wonder what the difference is. In my mind, they're very complementary. And sort of as Ronak said, in the learn phase, what we're focusing on there is helping people just get started with stuff. And NRE Labs is very much in that vein. If you want to set up a 1,000 node test network to make sure that the way that you want to do your design is actually going to function, I'll just tell you, NRE Labs is not your candidate. We have other resources for that. Feel free to get in contact with us there. What NRE Labs is meant to do is it's meant to bring those who have zero. It's really optimized for the people who have zero experience. Now there's something there for everybody, but if you have zero experience with automation, you just want to play with some stuff, that's exactly who I created NRE Labs for. That's exactly who the team of us that have worked on this have created NRE Labs for. It's with you in mind. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that's it for slides. Let me very quickly shift over to a demo, because I think that's probably the most important part. So this is the NRE Labs site. It's pretty cool. It was designed by, it wasn't designed, it was thrown together at 3 a.m. I'm not a designer, shocker. So here's an interesting lesson. I'll just dive right into a lesson. So this is the experience you get. You load the page. You notice I didn't log in. It's not because I logged in advance. It's because that's what it is. So this happens to be an introduction to YAML. Who has experience with YAML? Anybody have used YAML? Okay, let me reverse that. Who has no experience with YAML? Drew Connery Murray. Come on up. Come on up. I want to show you something.
You're getting called out.
Wow. Yeah, disconnect.
I got to disconnect.
Disconnect the mic.
Pop me down, number 2.
Throw a curveball. Yeah. All right. How you feel?
Nervous.
You're nervous. Oh, join the club. So here, let me actually do you a favor. Let me give you the coat. And now I look silly without this. You don't have to wear that if you want. I only have a little bit of lice.
So talking about the code, there was a question by Mel Zura.
Yeah, go for it.
What's the purpose of the code?
The purpose of the what? I'm sorry.
Of the coat.
Oh, of the coat? Oh,
that was a question by Mel.
It makes me smarter. I'm sorry. It makes me smarter. Now he's smarter. So you don't know anything about YAML, yeah?
I know nothing about YAML.
Cool. So why don't you go ahead and just type into the terminal, and I'll tell you what to type.
Okay.
So we want to test this as just make sure we know the environment. Okay. Type uname, so UNAME.
YOU or just
the letter U, sorry. And then space -A. Enter. No, I'm just joking. So you're good. So this is actually, I should give you some background. This is actually a Linux container running inside of Kubernetes. And it's actually provisioned on demand. So when you load the page, it's created on demand for you. Now I did preload the page, so you might have to wait like a few seconds. I'm sorry. I know in this day and age, like a few seconds is like, oh my God, no. But yeah, just be patient. The container's getting spun up on demand. The cool thing about that is because it's on demand, it's his. It belongs to him. So anybody in the room that's going to this lesson, they're not in the same container. They can run their same commands. And by the way, you can change stuff. You can delete the file system. Please don't do that.
Is that this button?
It is. Oh my God, you came very close. So the cool thing about this is it's very interactive, but you don't know anything about YAML. So like it's cool that you have a terminal, but you can spin that up on your laptop, right? Like you need some sort of guidance to see, at the very least, some commands to run that you can then reverse engineer.
Yes.
The cool thing about that is you have the commands here on the left side of the screen. So there's two cool things about this. First off, the commands that you need to run are there, but guess what? You don't even need to type them. You can. We've shown that you can type whatever you want in the terminal, but if you want, you can just click that button. Paste it in for you. Now, this particular lesson is trying to teach you the concepts behind YAML, and so there's some sort of Pythonic references here where you can import the YAML file and it turns into a Python list. So why don't you hit that second button and do that? Okay. So the first command is Python. It enters you into the Python interpreter, and then it runs some Python code to open that YAML file and then load it into a Python list. And so I'm going to have you type something, so I'll take the mic. Why don't you, let's deviate from the lab guide a little bit, right? We've kind of thrown out the instructions. Do you play with Legos?
Yes.
Instructions are overrated, yeah?
Depends, yes.
Okay, sure, I'll take it. So let's deviate from the instructions, because it's your environment. You can do what you want. Type the word type, and then open parenthesis, and then that word you see there, YAML list. capital L. One lowercase l before the capital L. Yeah, you got it. You got it. M, and then L. Perfect. And then do the close parenthesis. Enter. Okay, so what this tells us is it's a Python list. Yeah. Now the cool thing about this, like you didn't learn like everything there is to know about YAML, right? That's not the point. The point is to get you some experience. You feel like you have a little bit of experience with YAML?
I feel like I have a little experience, yes.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, thank you, Mayor. Well done. Everybody give him a round of applause. So that's a very light introduction. I have other things to show, but I want the message I'm trying to get across there is, whoo, I feel smarter. The message I'm trying to get across here is we decided to optimize for folks. Again, there's content for everybody, but we feel like we've really well optimized this for folks that don't have any experience. And there's a multitude. I've talked with many people. They're just like, I don't know where to get started. There's no effort here. There's no barriers. And I can tell you, when we created NRE Labs, it was a crusade against barriers. Things like, I have to set up my own environment. No, you don't. You load the page. I got to sign up and get my email away and get hacked by Equifax or whatever. Nope, you don't have to do that. You just load the page. All of these barriers, we just systematically went through and destroyed them. And we made some sacrifices. Like I said, this sounds kind of weird coming from a vendor, but it's a worthy trade-off for us. So that's why we built it the way we did. Okay. There we go. Back to slide land. So, as I mentioned before, for us, workflows are king. This isn't just this sort of random mantra. This is meaningful. This is something that we align to for the NRE Labs project. Whenever we build anything into it, we keep this in mind. What does this mean? What this means is sort of what I touched on earlier. Tools don't solve problems. They're cool. They're fun to play with, but they don't solve problems. When you have to move this stuff into production, it has to solve a problem. And regardless of whether or not you use automation, we do this today. I don't care what level of automation you're at. We're all problem solvers. That's the definition of an engineer. How do we solve problems? What we do is we implement, either manually or automated, whatever, workflows to go against our infrastructure to accomplish a task. Let's say you need to bring up a remote site. There is some sort of either hopefully documented, but I know better, often not documented process for doing this. And sometimes for smaller shops, it's all in your head. And that's fine. Everybody's at different places. My point is that needs to be acknowledged. That workflow, that process that you go through, either in a documented form or not, whether in an automated form or not, has to be explicitly recognized. When we call those things out and we get good at describing the different steps of those, the algorithmic sort of logic that goes through those workflows, and taking nothing for granted, what we have is fertile ground for automating it. So it's good practice just to do regardless. I don't care if you're never going to automate. It's just good practice operationally. But it also sets the stage for automation. So for us, when we align sort of what the kind of content that we think about putting into NRE Labs, so this introduction to YAML was kind of fun, yeah? I mean, Drew had a good time, I think, I hope. It's not StarCraft, but it's close. So, it's fun, but again, it's about application of these technologies. You can't get to success in that automation last mile until you apply these technologies in a specific way. So I think everybody sort of implicitly knows that. I'm not really telling you anything new. The difference here is what we get is, and I should mention, the workflows, they're important, but everybody knows you can talk about the high level stuff all day, but when you need to put this stuff into production, the details very much matter. So I want to mention that. I think everybody goes through this. I've talked to many customers, and they all identify with this. We as engineers, we as technical people, we have a really good handle on where we're at today, what skill sets we have, what skill sets we don't have. We hear things, we hear buzzwords, we hear terms, and we hear, at conferences, we hear things, and we sort of know ourselves and self-analyze on the skills that we have. So we have a pretty good handle on that. We don't really need anybody to tell us that. And similarly, because we're in charge of operations for our companies, we actually have a really good idea of the kind of workflows, as I mentioned, that we're going to need to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Again, maybe they're not like crazy well documented, but they exist and we know about them. We know what it's going to take when we need to add a new, when we need to bring up a new storage array. We know that storage array from vendor X acts this way, so we got to make sure we handle it thusly. All these things that are just baked into the DNA of an operations professional. These workflows need to be acknowledged. So we know both of these. We know both of these things. The problem always comes up if somebody tells you you need to automate. That's not really something you can argue about. It sounds good, right? I don't really have like explicit arguments against automation. It's not like it sucks. It's a horrible idea. Everybody kind of agrees it's a good idea, right? But the problem actually happens between these two stages. The two things we have a tight grasp on, there's this like cloudy part in the middle that's like really hard to define, and we can't really put meat on the bones. And I mentioned devil's in the details, right? If you're gonna put this stuff into production, that cloud ain't gonna work. And I don't mean the cloud. I mean this ethereal mess. I have nothing against the cloud. I use the cloud. The cloud is great. So those of us that actually have automated, we build this sort of mental map in our mind of the different pieces that need to fit together. This map, that may be obvious to myself and a few others in the room that have automated before, is incredibly not obvious to literally everyone else, right? All of these things, I take this for granted. I'm guilty of everything I'm talking about today. We take for granted all of the little teeny lessons we learned along the way by doing this stuff in production, or even not in production, just blogging about it. All this stuff we picked up along the way. And then somebody that's totally new to automation, they come in, they're like, oh yeah, I want to use automation to do config management. Or somebody tells them, hey, you need to learn automation so you can do config management. Thanks, I guess I'll figure that out. They go down this path, they inevitably start looking at tools, but what kind of sucks about this process is there's a slew of landmines sitting back here that if you don't know this stuff, you're just gonna struggle. And usually the way that works out is one of two ways. You either break your network, nobody wants that, or you just spin your wheels and get depressed about, quote, how little you know, when in reality you are actually most of the way there, you just need to fill in some of the gaps. So if we're going to move the industry forward, I think what we have to do is explicitly go after this problem. So workflows are king. We start with the use case. We start with what it is that we're trying to do, but we cannot ignore all of the prerequisites, whether they're tools or fundamental knowledge. So we start here, but we have to map this out. Sound good? So let's take another example, compliance validation. Anybody ever worked on like a federal network, military network? You know what the STIG is? Heard of that? So it's similar to like what you would expect in like PCI or HIPAA, something like that. And they're publicly available. You can see them. I'm actually going to show you a lesson on this. It's a set of guidelines that are mostly common sense, but they're required for military network devices to have certain configurations to reduce the attack surface, right? Pretty good idea. And the task of constantly making sure that your network devices are compliant with the STIG for their vendor is time-consuming, to say the least. I'll leave it at that. It sucks. And we know this. Like I said, we all know these workflows. And for people that do military stuff, it's like second nature to them. They don't even need to think about it. It's just part of their operations DNA. So they think about this all the time, and they know that automation, they implicitly know automation could help. It's not a matter of motivation. It's a matter of how do I get there, right? And so we map out things like this. It's like, well, somebody that's done this for a living can talk about the different tools that might help. So JSnappy, Napalm, as an example. You can also talk about what prerequisites exist for those tools. Like you probably need to know a little bit of YAML and Bash for JSnappy, and then Bash, Jinja, and Python for Napalm. Again, if you've done this for a living, it's kind of obvious, but I guarantee you for most people it's not. And I think it's important for us to explicitly call it out and provide tools to map that out. So that leads me to my second phase of my demo. So I go back to the page, the NRE Labs page. If you click on Search Lessons, you're presented with this screen that shows the NRE Labs Advisor. And everything I'm going to talk about, you can also bypass if you want, if you know the lesson that you want to access. Let's say you want to go back to the YAML lesson, you can just click on that link, and it'll send you right back to it. So this isn't forcing you down a path. But let's say you don't know what content you want, you just want to learn something. Let's say you start with that workflow in mind. I know that I need to automate compliance verification, or maybe I just want to search for STIG. And I type that into the box. You can see I have some search results here. Now you can see that there's some other search results that may be related, but they're ranked according to confidence. And I can say, oh, look, that description for that lesson looks exactly like what I want. It says, talks about the DoD infrastructure and saving time for manual data gathering, because that's what I do today. So let's click on that. Again, you're not presented with a lesson. What's happened in the back end, and I can show you how this works. It's freaking cool. We've actually decorated each of these lessons. Remember, they're all in Git. They're all text files. We've decorated that metadata with prerequisites. So each lesson has a list of prerequisite lesson IDs, right? So the STIG lesson has a list of lessons that maybe feed up into that, something like JSnappy or Napalm. Guess what? Those lessons do too. Those lessons require you to know things like YAML and Bash and Python. And what happens in the back end, there's an API behind the scenes that does this for the front end. It presents it presents a flattened version of that dependency tree and says, here's all the dependencies that you may need to know about. So what I do as a reader, I don't need to guess as to what kind of skills I need going in. It's listed for me here. And the cool thing about this tool is I can give myself a self-assessment. I know Napalm pretty well, and as a result, I know, let's say Jinja pretty well. I know YAML kind of well. Let's say I don't know JSnappy at all, and I know Linux kind of well. Let's say I know Napalm really well. So we submit this, and it renders this report out, which I'll zoom out so you can kind of see it. Renders this report out, which you can customize. Let's say Matt's journey to Stig, or let's say Drew's journey to Stig. It's not all about me. And the cool thing about this is these links are clickable, so you can actually go to the lessons from, if you print this to a PDF, which you can do using this button, by the way. Yes, Matt learned how to print stuff in JavaScript. So you can do that. Basically, what this does for you is it tells you, your goal is down here. I can scroll down and show you the last item in this node is automated Stig compliance validation. So that's where you're going. And you get this cool heat map of the things that you need to focus on to get you there. Because more than likely in this journey, you're going to discover that you actually know some of these things going in, and you want to have that represented in this report. So I don't necessarily need to go over Napalm again. I really know it pretty well. I'm pretty weak in Linux and YAML and JSnappy, so I'm going to focus there. Right? Helps you focus your efforts. But more importantly, regardless of whether what strengths you have, the journey from where you are, whatever that is, to the end destination that you specified is explicitly given. There's no guesswork here. There's no what if I'm going to encounter something, or there's no landmines of a lesson that refers to some other language that we don't have a lesson about. That doesn't happen. We build prerequisites in as an explicit map so that you have no guesswork. You don't have to figure out what else do I have to learn. It's all here in the report. That's pretty cool. So yeah, so that's the advisor. Actually, let me go back to that. I want to show. Let's say one of the prerequisites was JSnappy. So this is a tool that Juniper uses. You can go straight there, but I actually already have it open, so let's just go straight to that tab. So JSnappy is kind of cool. As you might have seen when Drew was up here with the YAML lesson, we have a pretty similar layout, right? We have a terminal to the right, and we have a lab guide to the left. So you don't need to know anything about JSnappy. You don't really have to know anything about anything. Although it would be meaningful if you knew something like Python, that would be helpful, because that's a prerequisite for this lesson. But there's a few other cool things here too. So you don't just have a Linux container. You might also notice there are some other tabs as opposed to the YAML lesson we saw. VQFX1. So again, no alt tabbing to your terminals. You can SSH to some public IP that totally doesn't host malware. Not that that happens, I'm making a joke. But VQFX1 is something that we've spun up in the cloud on Kubernetes for you to use. So remember what I said about the Linux container that Drew was using. It's spun up on demand, right? So it's his. You can do whatever he wants. Same applies here. Every resource that we spin up in this is spun up on demand for you. Trade-off being, yeah, it might not be super instant. This takes maybe 30 seconds to come online because of the network devices. But it's your environment. And the cool thing about this is not only is it your environment, but these network devices are connected together in a triangle topology. And we can change this, but this lesson shows them in a triangle topology. Now, the goal of the lesson isn't to talk about cool networking stuff that we did with Kubernetes, although that exists. The point of the lesson is to show you JSnappy in action, showing you how to write unit tests for your network. So let's go through that. So you might notice that if I show BGP summary on VQFX1, there's no BGP configuration at all, so obviously we don't have any neighbors. If you click on these two examples, you'll see a few YAML files. This is just, not to get too into the weeds on JSnappy, but you can see this particular config file just lists our devices and the username, password, and ports that you need to connect to them. And then similarly, we have another YAML file. This is, again, something JSnappy specific that lists tests to run against our infrastructure. Now, this is user definable. And by the way, you have a text editor in the terminal. So if you wanted to edit these tests, maybe add your own and then copy them out and run them in your environment, totally fine. It's your environment, spun up on demand. So you can do that. But the canonical example that we have for you is pretty simple. You say, I assert, it's an assertion, just like any other unit test. I make an assertion and I fail if it's false. I assert that there is one group, BGP group configured. I assert that there are 2 BGP peers configured. And I also assert that there are 0 down BGP peers, meaning they're all up. So if I run this test, because as you probably can guess, all of our tests are going to fail because there's no BGP configuration, so there are no peers. So all of these tests we see as a result of this have failed. Now that's a little crazy. Maybe you have a little more complex configuration, you say like, yeah, I expect that these BGP peers are here, maybe one of these tests fails. That's really valuable because that can help narrow down where the problem is very quickly. In many cases, faster than monitoring. Again, if you're making changes and you say like, I want to make this change, run the test first and then maybe right after, it'll tell you right away if something's wrong. So that's just sort of a little thing on unit testing in general. But the point of the NRE Labs lesson is you get to see that in action without deploying this on your infrastructure. Now, in many lessons, you actually have multiple labs. So this whole thing is a lesson. If you click the dropdown, you can see that we actually have 2 labs inside of this lesson. So obviously, we probably want to see the lessons pass, right? So if we could take a break while I reconfigure BGP. No, I'm just joking. I'm not going to reconfigure BGP. This is another cool thing we're doing. So I mentioned these network devices are spun up on demand for you, right? This is your environment. When you go between labs, what's actually happening is it's spinning up something, a little bit of Kubernetes speak. It's spinning up Kubernetes jobs, which are, for the sake of argument, they're containers that run Napalm. Who here has heard of Napalm? Cool. So for those that don't know, Python library for doing network automation stuff. We have a lesson for Napalm too, by the way. It's spinning up Napalm in a pod all behind the scenes. You don't do this, you don't even see it, and it's actually reconfiguring all those devices based on the lesson definition. So the lesson definition says, hey, that second lab uses this totally different configuration. Can you go apply it? So while that progress bar was showing, all of that was taking place. So I've been talking this whole time. You've seen that, right? So I can do show BGP summary, and you can see, oh, it looks like VQFX1 didn't connect. Sometimes this happens. Let me refresh. There's a bug for the terminal. Sometimes it fails to connect. If you refresh, it fixes it. Guess not. Let me do it on VQFX2. Show BGP summary. So you can see that that's working. So BGP peers are up. Again, it's a triangle topology, so the same is true on VQFX1 with just different peers. But we can go back to Linux 1, and you can see, again, we print out the tests. Those assertions haven't changed. 1 group, 2 peers, and 0 down peers. So let's just rerun the test. Because the configuration's taken place for us, all of the tests are going to pass. Now, the thing I want to highlight here isn't that we've reconfigured. That's pretty cool. But the reason we've done that is we don't want to place, again, this whole 90% learning stuff to learn the 10% of stuff that you actually came to learn, that's unacceptable. So we've done everything possible to keep you, the learner, focused on exactly what you came to learn. You didn't come here to learn about how BGP is configured. I would hope that you probably know how to do that before coming to this lesson, but that's fine. The point is, this lesson is about learning unit testing, specifically with JSnappy. Anything else is a distraction. So we try as best we can to keep all of those other obstacles out of the way. And reconfiguring things to fit the mold is part of that. So I want to hit on this real briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is super cool. Anybody use Jupyter notebooks? So Jupyter notebooks are really cool. If like Python scripts and blog posts had a baby, that would be Jupyter notebooks. So like if you wanted to run interactive Python code inside of your blog post, many of us do this where we write blogs and we do like little code snippets. Like that's easy to do, but it's not interactive. What if each of those code snippets was an interactive Python interpreter that actually executed the code inside? Badass, right? That's what a Jupyter notebook is. Wouldn't it be cooler if there was a Jupyter notebook server that was executing these notebooks in the same virtual environment as all of our network devices and our Linux containers? And it was actually plugged into those things. How badass would that be? That's what we've done. So the cool thing about this Jupyter notebook is it uses some of the same principles. Like for instance, we're using the hostname VQFX1. And the cool thing about running inside of Kubernetes is everything is namespaced. So I don't need to provide an FQDN here. When I say VQFX1, it's your VQFX1, not Drew's, not anybody else's around the table. And that's pretty cool. And because it's in a Jupyter notebook, I don't need to type any code. I just execute it. And you can see I'm just going to go next through these examples. It's opening a connection. It's retrieving the facts from this device. It's just a list of common facts that you might want to know, like vendor is Juniper, model is VQFX 10,000, that kind of stuff. So if you have Jupyter notebooks or you know somebody that has Jupyter notebooks, we can actually use those as the lesson guide. So we're not just demolishing barriers for consumers, we're demolishing barriers for people who are contributing content too. It's not acceptable for us to have a platform that makes it difficult for people to contribute because we've failed our mission if we've done that. This is not a Juniper thing. This is an industry thing. So there are a lot of Jupyter notebooks out there that exist for teaching things like network automation. And we've created a way for you to reuse that content as easily as possible. That's pretty cool. Thanks, Lisa. So last demo, and then I think I have a few minutes left. We'll get into some of the weeds. I mentioned the whole purpose of everything that we've been learning up to this point is automated STIG compliance validation. So what you'll see, the last two lessons are sort of a 101 thing, like here's how JSNAPy works, here's how Napalm works. This lesson is actually focused not on new tools or new concepts, it's about the application of those tools. This is the culmination of everything we've been learning, and we haven't left the browser yet. It's pretty cool, right? So we go down this path, and again, we know a lot of this stuff because, I need to reconnect actually. We know a lot of this stuff because we saw this in the Juniper notebook for Napalm. It's just going to rerun some Python code for us and show that, for instance, the SNMP information is showing that we have a read-write string installed in the configuration. Well, guess what? The US military doesn't think too kindly about read-write strings. And you can see that in the tests that we've written. So this is a way of unit testing with Napalm. Again, we've learned Napalm already. Now we're applying it to solve this particular problem. I need to make an assertion that when I submit the function get SNMP information, that the community string antidote, which is just the name of the string, is set to read-only mode. That's the assertion. And by the way, we've decorated that with the actual STIG compliance number. And like I said, if you've been in those shoes where you have to enforce compliance on your network for these kind of behaviors, guarantee you have this memorized. So this is going to call out very specifically to those that know this pain that this is going to solve that problem. So you can see this runs the test. Now the way Napalm does this is it just prints out a bunch of JSON. Don't worry about reading this. The important part is up at the top where it says complies equals false. It means there's no compliance. And that's because we have a read-write string. So I'll run this snippet to very quickly fix the problem. Now obviously you should probably automate this as well, but for the sake of the example, we've just run it via the CLI. So you can see that we've set the community string to read only, and then I'll rerun the test, and it'll show complies equals true. So again, the point of this isn't to learn Napalm. Ideally, you would have already learned it, and we're not leaving you high and dry. We're showing you what that path looks like so you can have that information going in, but we're mapping it out for you. Okay, any questions up until this point? Because I have a little bit more to share, but it's sort of technical deep dive, and we can kind of be flexible on that.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about consumption kind of being the problem at this point. How realistic do you think it is that network engineers will take the time to learn this versus just expecting another tool to come out to kind of do the problems for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, how likely are network engineers going to be able to pick this up or be willing to pick this up? I think I can speculate and say, I think there's going to be a ton of adoption, or I think there's going to be, limited adoption. But, the reality is we're in this situation for a few key reasons, and those key reasons are pretty obvious at this point. We've created barriers, right? And I believe, we're in these positions not because we are incapable or incompetent. We're in these positions because of the barriers that have been placed in front of us. I think if we work at removing those barriers, some of those problems will start to go away. I think most people in the industry actually crave this stuff. They just start down the path and they encounter landmines. So I think if we can start solving some of these problems and putting the barriers down, I think we'll see a very different industry. Go for it.
Is there an opportunity, and is Juniper investigating some kind of certification program around automation?
We're always looking at that kind of stuff. Yes. So we actually have some of that already. This is something that we're constantly thinking about adding to. We do have a DevOps track for some of our existing certs, but we're always adding content there. I think similarly, a lot of folks learn different ways. This is sort of a learning by doing thing. We want to make sure that people can learn that way, because that's how I learn, right? So selfishly, that's the kind of stuff I like to see. But the structured learning and again, mapping that path out, that's super useful. And so we do that kind of stuff all the time. So the DevOps track, that's available now. Actually, I think at Nextwork we recently broke that up into 3 separate certs. So instead of just the one, you can do different tiers. So we have that as well. But yeah, we're constantly thinking about this, especially not just from a Juniper perspective, but again, fundamentals and things that aren't really tied to a product, but you still need to know them. So we're constantly thinking about adding content like that. Anything else? Cool. So I have a few more minutes. Anybody want to hear some nerd knobs and how it works? Maybe some of the behind the scenes details? So let's see. What's a good slide to show? So I'll show this. I'll really just focus on these 2 slides because I think these show the majority of what we've built. So I mentioned everything's on top of Kubernetes. We use Kubernetes as just the orchestrator for running the compute workloads that are required for all of the lessons. So everything you spin up is running inside of a Kubernetes pod/container at the end of the day. But on top of that, we need to make certain decisions about how that information is presented. So the front end that you saw is called Antidote Web. That is a combination of JavaScript, HTML, CSS, the kind of stuff you would expect. A teeny little bit of Java, as little Java as was required by the technology. We're using a project called Guacamole, and it basically does HTTP tunnels between the servlet and the front end to allow us to do the SSH magic. So just a little bit of Java that makes that possible, but the majority of the logic on the front end is actually JavaScript. The back end is a component called Syringe. This is actually written in Go. What this does is it presents an API to the front end and makes all of those lesson details available. Now, the really cool part about that is no content at all, none, is defined in either of those two components. There is no content that you saw today that's inside of either of those two components. We've broken that out into an abstraction that allows you to define those things as code. And so NRE Labs itself, the content that you just saw, is actually its own repository as lesson files, right? Lesson directories. And so if you wanted to, you could take the open source that's here on the platform layer and sub that out with your own lessons and offer that yourself. Right? So we've sort of segmented those. I won't say disaggregation. We haven't done that. We kind of have, though. So a little bit more detail on how this works. For those that are familiar a little bit with how Kubernetes works, we have like I said, we have most things deployed inside of Kubernetes as pods. Now there's things on top of that make things more resilient, replication controllers and things like that. But these are the components. So everything goes through a load balancer. I think that's pretty obvious. All the requests, from the front end goes through this load balancer, gets delivered to the component that you need to access. So for most people, that's going to be this Antidote Web thing. That's the servlet that runs on the back end that allows you to do the terminal session, which is pretty cool. Similarly, the REST API that's offered by Syringe is also offered there. So there's a path for going to the Syringe API, and the front end knows how to get to that. One part that actually exists, but I haven't demoed it because we're still working out the kinks, but it actually does work to a degree because this is how we show Jupyter Notebooks. You can actually use HTTP to access certain lesson resources. Not everything's reachable over SSH. Let's say you have an IPAM that you need to show the UI for. Let's say you're running Netbox and you want to show that. We have the ability to show that in an iframe as a tab, just like it was another SSH session. So that's pretty cool. And so effectively what's happening here is Syringe is sort of the brains behind the scenes where it's saying, hey, I know that somebody's requested lesson 15, because they call that over the API. The front end says, hey, I need lesson 15. And baked into its logic, it looks at its current state where it shows like all of the different lesson definitions. And because of that definition, that again, we've stored it in Git, it knows what resources to spin up. It says, oh, I need 3 VQFXs, and they need to be networked this way. You can actually see some of that. If you look at the networking, this is a kubectl command where you say, hey, show me the state of this pod. So this is the lesson 32, some session ID, and then the name VQFX1. This is the actual networks that it builds on the back end. All I do is I specify how those pods connect or that they need to connect, and the networking behind the scenes does its magic. Actually uses Linux Bridge. So that's pretty cool. Any other questions before I wrap up?
So you said this is an open source project.
Everything is open source.
Right, it's sponsored by Juniper, but it's open. How, if someone were interested in continuing this bot into the mission, how do they get involved?
Yes, let me go to that last slide because that is important. So if you want to contribute, please do. Everything here is open source. That's the whole point of this. It's not to be a Juniper resource. It's meant to be a community initiative helping everybody focus on the workflows. And so if you want to join the EngNet Slack, we have a channel there. The GitHub organization, NRE-Learning, is there. That's where everything is hosted. Various repos inside that org, but it's all under that org. There's also the docs, the project that powers all this. We actually call it Antidote because we have NRE Labs as sort of the Juniper-sponsored version of this, but Antidote is the name of the software. And then finally, you can follow us on @NRE Labs. And of course, if you want to go to the site, it's labs.networkreliability.engineering.